Hello and welcome to our channel Interstitial Cystitis India. Today my special guest is Mrs. Neelanjana Singh. She's a dietitian and she is the co-author of this book if you can see it, this book, Indian Diet for Interstitial Cystitis. Eat healthy and protect your bladder. This book she wrote in collaboration with Dr. Rajesh Taneja from Apollo, Delhi. So today my guest is Mrs. Neelanjana Singh. Ma'am, please welcome.
Thank you, Balaka, for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here on this platform with you.
Yes. I have, for a very long time, I had wanted to interview you, but for some reason it was not happening because you have wrote a very vital book for all of us. This book is now like a, a guidebook for all of us, the patients. They are finding this very helpful. So today my session would be regarding how patients can eat and use Indian diet to heal themselves. So my first question is that, what happens, especially abroad, when patients go to a doctor, they are always discouraged to eat Indian food. They are always told that Indian food is very spicy, you should avoid Indian food. But we as Indians, we are so used to eating Indian food that giving up our staple diet and shifting to something absolutely new is difficult. But then you wrote this book where you said that Indian diet is not as harmful as it is said to be, because we also have bland versions. We also have healing properties in our spices, in our lentils, everything. So my first question is that what are the things that in Indian diet that can help IC patients?
So Balka, you put it in context very nicely, that although we are told that Indian diets are very they can be a trigger to IC patients, so we should avoid Indian diets. But like you rightly said, Indian diets are so diverse. It's true that in certain parts of India, there are a lot of chilies that I use, whether it's in Andhra Pradesh or Rajasthan. So the food is hot, and that could be a trigger factor for IC patients, and some of them do sort of react to these hot spices. But many parts of India, the food is quite bland, and the spices, we know that they are so diverse. Again, all kinds of spices. There are spices that we use in summer, there are spices that we use in winter, there are spices for the rainy season. So these bioactive chemicals that are found in spices are not the same. So you cannot say that all spices can trigger the inflammatory response in IC patients. So talking about spices, it's also the quantity that is used. That means the dose. Just like a medicine, food is also dose based. So if you're using spices in smaller quantities, that may not trigger the response in everybody. So similarly, we need to use the spices which are somewhat known to be safe. We are not giving specific spices as yes or no, but we can say that in general, like the spice like methi dana or dhania seeds, these are not pro-inflammatory and will not increase inflammation in the body. But there could be spices like the chilies or maybe large quantities of ginger. Say what happened in the pandemic, lots of people were having kadhas many times a day with lots of spices, and that was known to trigger, and that is why the urologists, nephrologists saw a lot of people coming into the clinic with flares. So it is not just the spices, the names, but also the quantity used. But there are spices like fennel, which have a cooling response, and we take it in the summer because we know that spices act differently, and there are a whole range of these spices that can be used. And the ones which are offenders can be cut out, and you can gradually add them back into the diet to see the dose that you tolerate. I hope that answers your question, Balika.
Yes, madam. Yes, that answers very well. So, generally, what role does diet play in IC? Like many patients, they say that diet is not helping us, even though they are saying that I'm taking bland food, but it is not helping us. So, is it like, will diet work for every IC patient, or are there patients who may not benefit from diet, or are they doing the diet in a wrong way? That is the reason they are not getting any benefits. Could you just explain this to us?
Yes, very pertinent point. We are all individuals. As individuals, we are different. So no two individuals are the same. There may be some common factors. We may have height, which is common with some of us, which is like some people may be short, some may be tall, but there are some factors, maybe brown eyes in most of the population. So, but every individual is different. That is why the role of diet, we cannot say that this is the IC diet that you have to follow to make sure that you don't have any symptoms. So it has to be customized, it has to be personalized, because people don't react to food in the same way. Each one of us is different. So we can give some guidelines. We cannot say that this is the IC diet which every IC or BPS patient should follow. So, and I have seen in my practice that almost 80 or little over that, or 80% of the patients seem to report some kind of link with diet, with food. It may vary from person to person, but there seems to be some kind of connection with food for most people. But it's not necessary that everybody is affected, because as individuals, maybe they are taking a diet in those doses where the offenders are not really bothering them. So it is too many things that have to fit the puzzle to understand the diet and its effect on the bladder for IC patients. But for a large majority of IC patients, the diet would be a component in the management plan which would be helpful. So understanding the diet that works for that particular individual, which is customized, personalized, will be helpful in the overall treatment plan.
Yes, ma'am. This is a very important thing that you said, that diet needs to be customized and personalized, because just it is not one size fits all. Every patient has unique needs, dietary needs, so they have to modify according to them. And yes, you're again correct that 80% of them, they do have a link to diet. So from this point, I would like to say that are all IC patient allergic to gluten and dairy, or again that depends on individuals, because gluten and dairy seems to be a trigger for most patients.
Yeah, quite rightly said, Balaka, that there is a lot of overlap of IC patients with IBS, irritable bowel syndrome, and also overlap with certain autoimmune disorders like celiac disease. So this overlapping kind of symptoms that people who have ICBPS also have problems such as gluten sensitivity can occur, and it is being seen in a large number of cases. So in such cases, again, this has to be actually seen in terms of getting some tests done to see whether it's gluten sensitivity, or whether there is no particular test to see whether a patient has IBS, but it is a functional disorder, and we have to see by eliminating things as to whether the symptoms are better in terms of the diet being modified, are the symptoms better, and you have to eliminate all other problems of the gut like inflammatory bowel disease, etc., and to come upon the diagnosis of irritable bowel syndrome. So if a patient of IC also has irritable bowel syndrome, there may be good reason to avoid certain foods which can trigger symptoms of irritable bowel syndrome. So in such cases, or a patient of wheat sensitivity or say celiac disease definitely will need modification in terms of gluten in the diet if it has been found so. But it cannot be said that all patients of ICBPS should avoid gluten and milk or lactose, and these are offending foods for everybody. But they have to be, there's a certain subset of people who will definitely benefit from such restrictions or elimination from the diet.
Yes, ma'am. So, ma'am, what are the gluten substitutes that are available in India?
Actually, of late in the last decade, I think we have been flooded with gluten-free foods, and they naturally, or say in India, we did have a lot of gluten-free options, but people were not really aware of it because they were not marketed as gluten-free. They were gluten-free inherently, but they were not marketed. But now with the marketing being so strong, we know which are those gluten-free foods. And I think there are lots of people who have gluten-free foods just for the sake of being healthy. Although I do not advocate such a diet for everybody, a gluten-free diet for everyone, because that has its own limitations. And now it has been seen that just avoiding gluten for the sake of avoiding it is not something very healthy. So one should be sure about what one is avoiding, because we don't want to land up with other problems just because we want to do a fad diet with avoiding gluten. But in terms of availability of gluten-free, mainly, as you know, gluten is found in wheat and wheat products. So we need to have substitutes for that. We have, at least in North India, roti, gehu ki roti is very, very, very integral to our culture, and therefore, in fact, when they are told that you can't have wheat or gluten from the roti that you normally eat, in fact, they go through a lot of psychological distress, and to even explain to them that there are rotis which can be just as tasty, healthier, or better for you, it takes a lot of effort. But there are lots of attas, like you have cholai ka atta, you have buckwheat, singhade ka atta, so jowar. So all of these attas, many of the millets like ragi, they are all gluten-free. And we have, of course, these are amongst the cereals which can be substituted for the wheat and can be given as the flatbread or roti, which is so integral to our meals. But when we look at the legume food group, that means the dals, all of them have actually inherently gluten-free properties. So most of them can be added to the flour that we are having and made into very nutritious rotis, or they can be a dal ka chila or pancake kind of thing, which can be made out of lentils. So that entire food group. So besides the cereal food group, which needs thought and which needs to be sort of explained to patients how to make these rotis, because when you use certain gluten-free flours, they're not easy to make. So what needs to be done, you have to tell them that you have to knead it with warm water, maybe mix some other flour, like maybe a lentil flour, keep it covered and let it sort of rest for a while before making it, and adding a little garam pani or lukewarm water makes better roti. So all these factors can be explained to them if they are using gluten-free flours. So that is again, otherwise what happens is the rotis tend to be dry, they break up, and people do not accept it that well, and they are unhappy. And if you tell people to change diets drastically, it it is difficult, and we should try and make it, as dietitians, we should make it easier for patients to accept what is absolutely necessary.
Yes, yes. Uh, um, you mentioned IBS, that IBS is often a comorbidity for IC patients. So, do you think that gluten sensitivity is more common among IC patients, those who also have IBS, or even without IBS, they can be sensitive to gluten?
It's actually a lot of the IC patients also seem to have IBS, but it's possible that even without having IBS, there could be certain people who are not tolerating certain short chain carbohydrates. And that is why you must have heard the low FODMAP diet, which has become popular for IBS patients. So these FODMAPs are actually short chain carbohydrates, which are not digested very well, and they reach the lower part of the intestines. And that is why these symptoms of maybe gas, bloating, etc., happen in IBS patients. So when these IC and patients who seem to have symptoms like this, so it's not a bad idea to follow a low FODMAP diet. But let me just say that low FODMAP diets are not any permanent diet fixtures for even IC patients or even IBS patients. These are diets where you cut down these FODMAPs and they are gradually reintroduced, because FODMAPs are not something villainous or bad. These are short chain carbohydrates which are needed by the body, but they are not digested, and sometimes they lead to these symptoms. So again, you can adjust the dose, and even in low FODMAP diets, you put back these carbohydrates in smaller doses and you reintroduce them and see how much you can tolerate, because these are also important. But when you're having symptoms, you cut it out.
What often IC patients also feel that oxalate is triggering them. So, is it true, or like, is it just something that?
Did you say oxalate?
Yes.
Oxalate. I don't think there's much link with oxalates as such with IC patients. There's not much evidence for that. And in oxalates, do you come across, have you heard any patient talk about any particular food, or are they talking about just oxalates by themselves?
I think by themselves, because if I'm correct, then turmeric also has oxalate, right? Hello?
It doesn't have too much. It's
Too
not a very heavy on oxalate. It has minuscule amount, but it's not a very rich source of oxalate. And considering the amount that we use, it's not a big contributor for oxalates.
Actually, from my experience, I have seen that most patients, they are scared about food. They generally develop a phobia. Whatever I eat, I'm going to flare. Some people even complain that I'm flaring from water. They say that if I change water, I flare. And they are not even ready to try, different food groups, and they feel that they are triggering from dairy, from gluten, from everything. So what is, as a dietitian, what would you think should be done to get rid of this phobia that they have regarding food, to try food?
Yeah, Balaka, I can understand that the fear that people go through, because they have been suffering for long periods and they have been quite on their own, and it's so confusing, and that fear is deeply embedded and they don't want to take a chance. So it is quite understandable, the fear that they go through. And you mentioned water. The thing about water is that water, when you have water, it produces the urine and you need to go. So what happens is IC patients seem to restrict water because they feel that they don't want to go again and again, whether it's the frequency or the urgency, whatever is bothering them. They feel that they are going to be plagued by the symptoms again, and they actually are scared of having water. But the thing is that the less water that they have, the more dehydrated and more concentrated the urine becomes, the more problem it creates. So it's a kind of a vicious cycle. So what I tell patients is that don't have large volumes of water together, like don't have a couple of glasses together, but just make sure that through the day you have either water containing foods like certain fruits, or you have cucumbers and things like that, or you have water in smaller doses through the day so that your urine does not get concentrated. The concentrated urine is not a good idea and definitely needs to be avoided. So to get over the fear, I think it's our job to instill that confidence in the patient that we will be able to solve this puzzle. We'll be able to sort of put it all together if you also sort of join hands with us, because it's not possible for the dietitian to do it alone. It is the patient's experience, which is also very important. And that is why we try and give them the elimination diet for 4 weeks. Possible offenders, whichever they think that they has been causing problems, we omit that from the diet for 4 weeks and gradually add them back over a 3-day course, one item over 3 days. And what you need to do is start with smaller doses, then increase to a larger dose, and then go on to the normal dose. So in that 3-day period, you increase the dose and you put back those offending foods to give it a trial and to be sure about the offending food. So elimination diets, going together with the patient, the dietitian, spending time in journaling, putting down all the facts together will help put the puzzle together and definitely once and for all put the fear out. But the thing is, it needs patience. You have to follow it for 4 weeks. It cannot be that in between you sort of cheat and have a few of those offending foods that have been eliminated. So if you're ready for that patience, a little bit of journaling for say a month, it will help decide the future course, and it will definitely put the patient at ease, because we'll be able to tell what exactly is happening by putting the pieces together.
Yes. Elimination diet you talked about, which is the first step towards IC healing. But what what would you suggest, that how should they start the elimination diet? Should they eliminate everything, or should they keep few things and eliminate only the common triggers? So could you just give us a brief on how to start the elimination diet?
See, when you start the elimination diet, before that, you need to sit down with the patient and try and understand over the period of time what are the offenders according to the patient. So you make a note of that and give them alternatives for that. It's just, you cannot say that just cut it out. And supposing the patient says that, okay, I find that whenever I have tea, I flare up and I feel that that's one of the triggers. So in the elimination diet, there'll be no tea for 4 weeks, and that is going to be quite tough for any patient who's having tea. So it is very necessary that instead of tea, what are the things that are acceptable? And most people get up in the morning and have tea, and Indians particularly are fond of tea. So it's important that you give them a substitute. You cannot say, okay, in this elimination diet, you cannot have tea for 4 weeks. So whether it is you want to add chamomile tea or you want to add a kahwa, which does not actually have the tea leaves in it. So depending on what is acceptable to the patient, what is acceptable to the dietitian as a substitute. So amongst those things, if it's a hot day, you can even tell them to have some lemongrass tea, or you can have some coconut water instead of tea. So depending on what the patient and the dietitian agree upon, you start with eliminating with the possible offenders, which is based on the patient's experience. Most of the people who land up at the dietitian's consult have been through a lot of trouble themselves, and they have a lot of experiences. So those are the possible offenders that they feel that can be eliminated. All of them can be eliminated in the elimination diet, because there are very few patients who come very fresh and not knowing what the possible offenders are. So based on that, you can prepare the elimination diet, but giving good substitute so that the patient is able to follow it. It's not for a day or two. So it's a 4-week plan. So you should be able to give them a good number of substitutes which are unlikely to trigger the flare.
What is to be done after 4 weeks? Once they more or less know the triggers, they will eliminate the trigger food for the rest of their life, or they can reintroduce them after a while.
See, supposing it's a trigger, like say it was tea or it was coffee or something very common, and the patient is keen to have it back or would like a trial. So usually we like to give a trial with a smaller dose, like 1/4 the dose, the next day it's half the dose, and then the full dose. So usually people tolerate with smaller doses. So if it's a diluted version of tea or coffee, it can be tried, and it should be provided you don't go back to the full dose in a day, and it can be added back. But say foods like certain kinds of fats, which may be a trigger, like trans fat, these are not healthy foods, so they can be substituted with healthier fats. So we don't want to add the unhealthy foods, but tea and coffee, these are debatable. Like excess can be unhealthy, but small amounts can still be healthy. So instead of having cups and cups of green tea, which could be a trigger again, if you're going to have one diluted cup of green tea in say 2 doses, like one half a cup in the morning and half in the evening, that's possible and definitely should be tried.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. This is really important. The next question that I want to ask is that suppose a patient has been newly diagnosed and has no idea about triggered foods. They are not even able to identify what is triggering them. So what are some of the trigger foods that you would ask them to avoid? Like apart from tea and coffee, what are the other sure shot trigger foods for IC
Yeah,
patients?
the common ones.
The
I
common
would
ones.
say alcohol. I would say any cheese which has been like there are some mold ripened cheeses. So those kind of extra fermented foods. And when I say fermented, extra fermented foods like pickles, etc., those can be avoided. But like I said, fermented foods are not to be avoided generally, but these are usual triggers. So initially they can be avoided because we are trying to see what could be possible. And these are common triggers. So these pickles, alcohol, say vinegar, then say chocolates and cocoa based things, then some different forms of chilies. The red chilies comes in many varieties. Those chilies can be avoided, and tomato purees and sauces can be avoided. And you can allow small amount of tomato, say one tomato or a couple of tomatoes through the day for cooking, but you can cut out these extra tomato based foods. So I would probably avoid all of these in the first go for patients who are newly diagnosed. And then once you start logging and recording your symptoms along with the food, you will be able to definitely in say a couple of months, you'll be able to figure out as to what needs to be done for you in particular as a patient, a particular patient, what is the diet suitable for that patient.
What about citrus fruits and sugar? Should that be avoided or?
Citrus fruits generally, especially in the form of juices, do lead to a trigger for a lot of patients. So definitely, initially there will be substitutes which can be given instead of the citrus fruit. So foods which have less acid, maybe papaya, and although all of them have different forms of acid, but if you don't give the juice and you stick to sort of a small bowl of fruits through the day, like a papaya or apple, etc., these can be given, but citrus juices and say concentrated lemonades, etc., can be avoided. But and the other thing about citrus, like don't give any vitamin C supplements, but you can give a lot of these green leafy vegetables which also have a lot of vitamin C, and that can be used as a substitute for these citrus foods.
Yeah, actually during COVID, most IC patients, they started to flare because they were given vitamin C capsules. So,
yeah, so instead of the capsule, you can have the food, and the leafy vegetables, although they are looked upon more as a source of folic acid and potassium, but they also have good amount of vitamin C, so that should be included in the diet so that they don't become deficient in vitamin C and their immunity is sort of built up.
So any spices that they should avoid, or all spices
I would say
small quantities?
No, not all spices need to be avoided, but say, like I said, that don't have the chilies if you are not sure about whether it's triggering you. So initially you can avoid chilies, but again, you can add it back in small doses, like minuscule amounts. But besides chilies, there are the other spices which can cause a flare if used in excess amount. Like I talked about ginger. ginger, when you use too much of it in kadhas, if you're putting it in tea and always having it to build up your immunity, so that could be cut out. But like I said, that there are other spices which can be used, whether it is methi dana or fennel. These are spices, and even that black cumin, jo kalonji, or that black cumin that we have, which is again quite beneficial, and it has anti-inflammatory properties, so that can be used. So other spices, you talked about turmeric also. So turmeric can be used and should not be cut out. It should not be sort of avoided. It should be part of the spice kitty that we can use for a patient.
Here is a question from one of the patients. She's asking, ginger, lemon, milk, curd, can we take them? And also, are there some alternate recipes for tea? So these are the two questions.
Yeah, tea. They have many different kinds of tea, and I think there's whole world of tea waiting to be explored. To just tell you the common ones that we use for IC patients: chamomile tea, then there's lemongrass tea, there is barley tea. So in fact, instead of using the tea leaves, you can use these lemongrass leaves and brew it. And of course, there are innovative ways to make this beverage like tea. You can sort of boil some of these spices like dhania seeds and jeera seeds and make it like a brew, but don't overdo it. The problem is that when you overdo it, you can, instead of benefiting, you can cause more problems. So just like we use tea leaves in small amounts for 1 cup of tea, so we can use lemongrass or mint or any of these healing spices to make a tea. And keva is another thing where we can add a little saffron and almond powder and brew it into a tea. So these are tea options. But the other question was about whether you can use lemon and curd. Lemon and curd are included in IC diets. They are not sort of as a blanket ban for all IC patients. Curd, usually we allow them one katori in a day if they are tolerating it, because it is unlikely to cause symptoms of bloating, cramping due to high lactose content. So curd is usually acceptable, but certain patients who seem to have some kind of intolerance to such foods may need curd to be cut out for some time while their body gets accustomed to getting back to smaller doses of curd. But most patients are able to tolerate curd. They may not be able to tolerate milk, but curd, say 1 cup, about 200 grams in a day, most patients are able to tolerate. And even lemon juice, concentrate, instead of concentrated lemon juice, you can give a small sort of squeeze of a lemon added to any other, say you can add it in a little dal, but don't add too much of lemon if you are noticing in your diary that there is causing any symptoms. So then be careful about using less of it, but don't have to say absolutely no to lemon and curd.
Yeah, just I would want you to explain them how to journal their food, whatever they are taking, the food items and their symptoms. In the book it is mentioned, but still I would just want to.
Yeah, let me see if I can find it and just show you what are the columns that need to be maintained in the food journal, so that it makes it easier for them to understand. So as you can see here, this is the journaling that needs to be done. So you need to put the date and what time of the day you've had it, the food preparation in one column. So if you're having, like, say, baigan ka bharta, you can write here. And besides baigan, sometimes you add little mutton to it, or you can add onions, etc. So whatever, tomatoes, sometimes it's made with mustard oil. So every region has its own typical, say, baigan ka bharta. So what is the quantity you had? And did you feel any kind of urinary symptoms which seem to be coming after that? Although the range in which the symptoms can occur, it can happen quickly, it can happen, say, even after a few hours, but you can sort of see the link and write the urinary symptoms here: pain, frequency, and also urgency. What was it that you felt? And was it a small amount that you avoided, medium or large? And did you undertake any usual kind of physical activities? That also can be mentioned. So this is the typical journaling that would help the dietitian understand from the record that the patient maintains. Because, like I said, it is putting the pieces of the puzzle together so that both the patient and the dietitian can put their heads together to find out what exactly and how the bladder is being affected.
So they need to maintain this journal only for the first 4 weeks or also later on, like for a longer
No,
duration?
first 4 weeks generally is good enough, but it may be in certain cases, if the journaling was not helpful for the dietitian, they may need to extend it a little bit, but usually 4 weeks gives a good idea as to what exactly is happening, connecting the bladder with the food and the symptoms.
So many patients, they are not eating a lot of things, like they are eliminating because it is triggering them. But do you think that eliminating food items from their list is also causing them, some kind of undernourishment? So how to cope with it?
Quite right. Unnecessary restriction actually causes more harm than good. But the fear in these patients is something that really overpowers them, and the fear is so sort of embedded in their minds that they'd rather not eat anything. So malnutrition is common because they're usually not told how to substitute. Like, supposing they're not having vitamin C rich foods because of the fear that that will cause some kind of symptom. So they are not told as to what are the other vitamin C rich foods, so that they are able to maintain good sources in their diet and they don't become deficient. So deficiencies is common, not so much of say calorie deficiency, but there is micronutrient deficiency and sometimes even protein deficiency, which can happen because overall they are being so restrictive. So restriction is fine, but undue restriction definitely causes more problem. And removing the fear and to tell them that this is what it is for you and you don't have to restrict everything to feel well, that will definitely go a long way in the overall treatment plan.
This is an extremely important point that you mentioned here, that we need to remove this fear and look at, having a more holistic diet so that they do not get deficient. um, we often talk about that IC treatment should be a teamwork. It is not the only job of, it is not only the job of the urologist to treat IC, but we need pain management doctors, we need dietitians, but most patients, they do not have access to a dietitian who knows about IC. So in that case, what should patients do? Because internet is full of too much of information, and often that is confusing. So what would you suggest that the patient should do in this case?
I think the biggest learning from COVID is that you don't have to actually be face to face with the dietitian. And just like we are doing this recording today, there are lots of dietitians who would be able to help even through certain consultations like this. And I think that it's important to have that connect with the person, and doing it remotely has now become possible more than it was earlier. And not to read too much on the internet if it's not a verified source. You can go to organizations who have the authority, teaching organizations which know about this condition and give you advice. And we have the Gibbs Society, which does a lot of awareness and going to the website to get the right information. Don't just sort of go to the internet and read whatever there is. So look at the source of the information. If the source is authentic, look at that, read it, and definitely there are usually ways in which you can contact these organizations or get help. So that would be a good way to get help and get correct information. But getting just information is very confusing, and it can actually cause more harm to you because it's distressing. So many things need to be, you have hundreds of sites, hundreds of people saying things about their own experience, but it's just one person saying a particular thing. It is not evidence-based medicine. So we have to look at evidence, look at organizations who work in this area, and look at what they have to say. You just don't follow anyone blindly just because somebody is putting out information. So look at authentic information. The Gibbs Society has a lot of information, and I think it should be the focal point where we can direct patients to sort of send in their queries, and you can have programs for them where they can have online consultations where as and when required, so that they get authentic information.
Yes, they should do this. Now, just tell us, this is just like, tell us something about the book, like your experience regarding writing the book, how it was.
The credit for the book goes to Dr. Taneja, who inspired me to start writing about it, because I could see that the patients were so confused, and they would just come with pages and pages of foods to be avoided, and they would be so lost. And it was very confusing even for me to understand that why is it happening that so many patients have so many different reactions. And with the help of Dr. Taneja, I understood a lot of mechanisms that sort of underline this disease and how foods are connected to the bladder, causing symptoms. So all of this helped me write down, and I have also tried to include real life situations, patients that I actually met and the trouble that they went through, and trying to make it as realistic and practical for them. It is all right to say something in theory and write down that you do this, do that, but giving actual practical advice as to what one can do if one were faced with this problem is what I really wanted to do, and make it simple, doable, practical. So this book tries to do that for IC patients, because I feel they are a neglected lot, in the sense that maybe they are not getting the attention that they deserve. And this book would be a method to reach out to them and tell them that there is a way out, and don't get distressed.
Thank you. Thank you for writing this book. I thank you on behalf of the entire IC community. So when can we expect another book? Are you planning to write another book?
I have been mulling over this and thinking that maybe I would like to do something where I try and put the wisdom from all forms of medicine, whether it is Ayurveda, naturopathy, all of them, the good part from all of them, into something that is holistic, which modern medicine also accepts. So trying to put it all together, because the diet that we eat today, we know that the gut microbiome is affected by it, and everything seems to be sort of telling us that it's the gut microbiome, these small organisms which are living within us, how they sort of deal with the food that we eat actually affect our health. So putting the wisdom from all these different forms of medicine and different forms of therapy, so that we are able to benefit, mankind is able to benefit. This is what I would like to do. I have sort of thought about it in my mind, but I haven't really started work on it.
I'm sure you'll start very soon and we will get another good book. So thank you, Neelanjana ma'am. Thank you so much for giving your time to take part in this session, because diet is one area where I think there is maximum confusion, because nobody knows which one is the right diet. So I am sure this session would help patients. They would get an insight into the IC diet. And I really thank you. Thank you very much from the entire community for writing the book, for taking part in this session, and for always being there for us, and for understanding what patients go through. Thank you very much.
I'm totally with you, and anything that I can do which can help make things better for IC patients, I'm always willing to do that. And thank you, Balaka. It was a pleasure interacting with you, and all the best to you. And I admire all the good work that you're doing.
Thank you so much.
Bye. Bye.